day, everyone. I am Lauren H. Nolasco from grade 12 GA Rutherford.
Today, I just want to share about one of the famous philosophers named Socrates. Socrates' concept of the self. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher considered to be the forerunner of Western philosophy. He was in particular a scholar, teacher, philosopher who influenced countless of thinkers throughout generations. His method of questioning, famously known as the Socratic method, laid the groundwork for Western systems of logic in particular and philosophy in general. Plato was considered to be his greatest student. In fact, it was Plato who wrote his philosophy. Socrates did not write anything. It was Plato who systematically articulated Socrates' philosophy through his famous dialogues, which also chronicled Socrates' life. Socrates was eventually accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. He could have opted for exile but chose death instead. It can be surmised that Socrates used this death as a final lesson for his students to face the adversities of life calmly and inexorably, rather than flee like chickens and ducks when he faced with storms in life. Socrates was fully convinced that philosophy must obtain practical results for the greater well-being of society. And for Socrates, the very first step towards the realization of this goal is the acquisition of wisdom through knowing oneself. As Socrates famously said, ultimate wisdom comes from knowing oneself. So, how does Socrates view the self? The key to understanding Socrates' concept of the self is through the philosopher's take on the soul. But Socrates' concept of the soul should not be viewed from the vantage point of Christianity. That is a religious conception of the soul. It is important to know that the ancient Greeks lived long before the existence of Christianity stood out for them. The concept of the soul did not have the same religious connotations that it has for us today. But what does Socrates actually mean by soul? Of course, we cannot know for certain what Socrates really meant by the term soul. But most scholars in philosophy agree with Frederick Copleston, a famous historian of philosophy, who believes that when Socrates speaks of the soul, the philosopher refers to a thinking and willing subject. With this conception of the soul as a thinking and willing subject, it is safe to assume that the soul for Socrates is the intellectual and moral personality of humans. So, when Socrates said the soul is the essence of the human person, he meant that it is the essence of humans to think and well. For this reason, the soul, or the self, for Socrates, is the responsible agent in knowing and acting right or wrongly. This is because for Socrates, the soul is the seat of knowledge and ignorance, of goodness and badness. Again, as the seat of knowledge and ignorance, of goodness and badness, the soul for Socrates is the essence of the human person. In other words, for Socrates, the soul is the person's true self. In fact, Socrates said that when we turn inward in search for self-knowledge, we will eventually discover our true self. Viewed for these advantages, the self is our inner being. Now, because the soul or the self is the essence of human person, and because it constitutes our personality, Socrates urges us to take care of our soul. But why should we take care of our soul? According to Socrates, we need to take care of our soul to attain the good life. As we can see, this is the ultimate goal of Socrates' philosophy. As Socrates said, the human person must see to it that her life is geared towards knowledge of the good life. And for Socrates, the good life simply means being wise and virtuous. This explains why, for Socrates, the good life is attained through the acquisition of knowledge, wisdom, virtues. Now, it is important to know that for Socrates, knowledge of the good life cannot be acquired exogenously, endogenously. For that reason, it is paramount that we devote considerable amount of attention, energy, and resources to making our soul as good and beautiful as possible. This conviction is expressed most visibly in perhaps Socrates' most famous statement, "The unexamined life is not worth living." This gives us a clear idea of what Socrates meant by knowledge in this context. To know is to know oneself. And that, for us to attain the good life, we need to examine our life. The reason for this is quite obvious. Virtue, which for Socrates is identical with knowledge, is intrinsic to the human person and which can be accessed through self-examination. Since virtue is intrinsic to the human person, Socrates was convinced that the human person can discover the truth of the good life.
And once a human person discovers the truth, she then does what she thinks is the right thing to do. That's the famous Socratic dictum, knowing what is right is doing what is right. Now, if knowing what is right is knowing what is right, what about the problem of evil? This seems to be a problem in Socrates' concept of the self. Socrates seems to think that humans were angels, that once they know the right thing to do, they act accordingly. Of course, Socrates was very much aware of the existence of evil in the world. However, Socrates, those who commit evil acts, are ignorant of the truth. They are ignorant in the sense that they don't have an immediate realization of the good. Thus again, examining oneself is the most important task one can undertake, for it alone will give her the knowledge necessary to answer the question how one ought to live her life. So, the famous Socratic dictum, knowing what is right is doing what is right, once the person knows herself, means that she may then learn how to care of it. Finally, and contrary to opinion of the masses, one's true self should not be identified with what one owns, with one's social status, reputations, even with one's body. According to Socrates, it is the state of the soul, the person's inner being, that is, which determines the quality of one's life. It's not the money, fame, elegant clothes, nice house, beautiful and expensive car, or high-tech gadgets that makes life meaningful, but knowledge, wisdom, virtue. Therefore, the true self for Socrates is one that is lived in accordance with knowledge, wisdom, and virtue. The true self is the virtuous self.